So, hi everyone, welcome back to the EU-Canada Business Summit 2023. I hope you had a great networking session. I hope your business card wallets are full of other connections you've made in this room and more to come still. My name is Rosie Birchard. I'll be your host for the next part of this summit. I'm a journalist and a presenter based here in Brussels. I have my own EU-Canada connection as I've reported extensively for CBC News, as well as other European outlets. Across the rest of this afternoon, we're going to go into a couple of different topics. So we're going to start with the discussion on energy and critical raw materials. Then we're going to be looking at Atlantic port mobility. And lastly, we're going to be diving into one EU-Canada business success story. So I'd like to start now with our panel on energy and raw material challenges. And I'll introduce you to our panel just shortly. But let's just talk a little bit about the theme, first of all, because we know energy, raw materials are going to be critical in this transition toward a low carbon economy. But I think the question we're really looking at together is how to make that transition happen, how to make it happen smoothly, how to make it happen efficiently. And of course, I think many of us will think that to get to that stage, that's going to require a really predictable and a stable economic environment to try and support that investment and innovation. Think about, for example, the automotive industry going under major changes, looking at toward electric and autonomous vehicles. Think about the energy sector shifting toward renewable energy and toward energy storage technologies. And of course, the raw material sector itself, which is facing growing demand for critical materials, metals, minerals. And of course, that requires in itself responsible sourcing, sustainable production practices. So now what we need to look at is collaboration, partnerships between government and industry, and how can governments and institutions really unlock the full potential of these technologies. And to discuss this, I'm joined by guests and speakers from business and from the government environment. So I'll introduce you first of all to Rob Brant, who's here on my left. He is managing partner at McCarthy Tetrault, which is a firm with a global range of legal services. It's advising on really large, complex assignments across Canadian and international interests. The company has a presence in Canada's major financial centres in New York City, also in London, from where Rob joins us. And Rob really is the authority because few people have as much experience as he does when it comes to transactions between European and Canadian companies. So Rob, welcome and thank you very much for your time. Next, I'll introduce you to Stefan Wilhelm, who is the Director of Strategy for Europe at Export Development Canada. That's Canada's export agency. So the agency helps Canadian companies really take their place on the world stage, creating jobs, increasing prosperity in Canada and beyond. Now, Stefan is based in London. He has had a rich and varied career supporting businesses of all sizes and across different continents. I know his expertise has ranged not only here in Europe, but also with responsibilities in the past for the Middle East and Africa. And last of all, I would like to introduce you to Javier Aragay from the European Commission. He works at DG Trade, the Director General for Trade, and he's the team leader there for the unit which represents industry, goods, energy and customs. He himself has a particular interest in critical raw materials, which of course is critical for this panel. And some of you here in Brussels might know or consider DG Trade within the European institutions, within the European Commission, as really one of the engines or the most powerful units. Why is that? Because trade is a centralized competence here in Brussels, so they have real legal decision-making power. Although, of course, I hope to not offend any of the other EU colleagues in the room. And I'd like to start with you, Javier, because we've seen over the last couple of years, and especially the last year and a half, trade coming into the topic on the agenda when it comes to geopolitics. The European Commission says on the record, it wants to use trade to try and build partnerships around the world, not only partnerships in terms of business, but also in terms of the geopolitics. And of course, the geopolitics have been becoming more difficult over the last couple of years. We've seen, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've seen tensions with regards to China. So I suppose what I want to start with is, with these with the war in Ukraine, we mentioned China, so with the European Union's ambitious environmental targets, but of course Europe's, some would say, limited environmental resources, how is the European Union strategically positioning itself in relation to do with, for example, everything to do with electric vehicles and batteries and raw materials more broadly, which is, of course, your area of expertise? Javier.
Maybe now better.
Can we hear Javier?
Hello, hello.
I think we can hear you.
Yes, good. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss a key challenge for the European Union. So indeed, we are not in an ideal situation. This is under a statement with regard to supply of those materials which are critical for electrical vehicles and batteries, but more generally for the technologies which are essential for the green and digital transitions. To give a number, apparently the EU is only in a position to supply about 1% of the minerals needed for electric vehicles. It's really not a lot. So we have to do better than that, because it is true that you said that naturally we are not particularly endowed. We do have some potential, some key minerals like lithium, for example, which are not tapped, and we have to do that. Now, that would not be dramatic, the fact that we are not supplying from the EU very much of the share we need, if it were not for the fact that supplies of all those raw materials are actually very much concentrated. And concentrated in partners which are not particularly, how would I say, like-minded to the EU. Yeah. So if we put together the excessive concentration and the change in the geopolitical landscape with much more acute tensions in the last years, we really have a challenge. So this challenge has been recognized, and in March the Commission adopted a package towards a reliable and sustainable supply of raw materials for the green and digital transition. This includes a comprehensive strategy, including increased supply from the EU and a stronger management of the supply chain. This is the core of the proposal for a regulation, a legal text. And the communication, which sets out the overall strategy, focuses on the external engagement. External engagement, much more external engagement with trusted partners, such as Canada, for instance, and putting together all our instruments for external action, including of course, our trade agreements. We have an excellent trade agreement with Canada that works, but more specifically, strategic partnerships in the area of critical raw materials, which are there to use available opportunities, putting together finance, putting together projects, putting together undertakings on sustainability in order to make things happen. And the third pillar, not with Canada, but with developing countries which are endowed with critical minerals, is the Global Gateway, which is our vehicle for partnerships with developing countries, focusing on the local value addition that we also want to use to address what is a European and a global challenge. Moving to the global challenge, it is not only the EU which has an issue with the supply of critical raw materials. The projections are that in a few years, according to the current trajectories, there will be shortages of most of them. So a massive increased investment is necessary. Most countries also have to deal with the issue of excessive concentration. And third, there is an issue of sustainability, meaning protection of the environment, protection of human rights, labor rights, etc. Mining has a terrible reputation. Processing is also quite heavy in terms of potential damage to the environment. And many of these minerals are located in places of the world which do not have strong governments. So unless we deal with this challenge properly, there will not be a reliable supply of raw materials. In order to address the global challenge, this is why the EU is putting forward a critical raw materials club, bringing together the big consumers, big industrialized countries, and resource-rich countries, including developing countries, to address together this challenge with a strong developmental dimensions in the form of local value addition. And of course, we are also discussing with Canada. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Javier. And you've painted quite a vivid picture there, like that figure 1% will really stick in my mind. But you gave us a bit more of a positive angle at the end there, and I think we should stick with that. Let's go into some cases that I think many would see as positive, because we've seen in recent months Canada bearing witness to a number of major investments announced in the electric car and battery sector. So, for example, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, Volta. So I would like to put this over to Stefan. What's happening in Canada? And do you think there's any sort of a strategic advantage that Canada has over, for example, the United States or the European Union when it comes to major investments in this key sector?
Thank you. I'll share my perspective as Canada's Export Credit Agency, which is a financial institution that, as you indicated, is here to help Canadian companies grow internationally, so engage in international trade and invest abroad. And I've been working for EDC in Europe out of our London representation since 2015, and been primarily focused on helping Canadian companies, and also, no secret, the Canadian pension plans are also very active in Europe, and we've been supporting them and their investments across Europe. But what's happened for us now in the last 2 years, and things have really accelerated now since Russia's war in Ukraine, is our pipeline of financings now in terms of European investors into Canada, which is something that we can also help finance as long as there's an export angle to that Canadian footprint, has never been stronger. You mentioned the names that have been in the news, Northvolt and ACC and Stellantis and so on. And what we're starting to see now is actually the tier 2 and the tier 3 suppliers, right, who follow those names to supply these massive giga plants that are being planned and built in Canada. And now as well, our pipeline of projects in the critical minerals sector is also growing. And that's an area where I feel that we as a financial institution that is owned by the Canadian government, have a duty to stretch our risk appetite for, because these are often projects, whether in Canada, some internationally as well, as was mentioned, that are often sponsored or pursued by more junior players, right, that don't have the track record or as deep pockets, or we're dealing with critical minerals that we hadn't really scaled yet in terms of commercialization. There's processing risk, higher environmental risk. And so we've been also working closer with European ECAs, to help these projects, move forward, recognizing that, as part of the energy transition, these are key. In Canada, Canada has about 21 of the key critical minerals that are needed for the global energy transition to happen. Canada has a very green energy grid, amongst the lowest in the world, with hydro and nuclear and so on. Canada is a like-minded partner, is a democracy where law prevails, has a very skilled labor force, especially if you look at hydrogen. A lot of the expertise in our oil and gas sector, can transition as well into the hydrogen sector. So there's many reasons why we think we are seeing this acceleration of interest and investment in Canada from European players. And we've already seen over the last 20, 30 years, Europe's share of foreign direct investment in Canada has increased. And we think that's just going to continue and accelerate. Europe will have an even bigger share. In terms of versus the US, we all know the IRA is the big elephant in the room. It's the same issue for, I think, our European friends. And it's a matter of focusing, right? Really playing on Canadian strengths and putting our eggs in specific areas where we think Canada has a natural advantage and not trying to cover the whole landscape, unlike our good friends in the US.
Rob, I want to throw this over to you because we've been talking about strategic advantages, and you have such a rich experience when it comes to regulatory environments. And actually, there have been some quite big changes coming up in Canada with regards to court decisions. Can you talk us through some of that and anything else you think that hasn't been mentioned in terms of these advantages?
Sure. And first, just to echo what Steph was saying about an increase in interest from Europe. I've been in London, our London office, for 25 years. And over those years, I've seen a couple of times interest in Canada amongst foreign clients peak, usually around spikes in commodity prices. And those don't generally last too long, but this spike that we're seeing, the same as Steph is seeing, feels a lot different. The realignment that's going on amongst the Western Alliance is not something that's going to be turned back anytime soon. So this feels more permanent, but we are seeing a lot more interest amongst European clients in doing business in Canada. And a lot of the things that Javier talked about that Europe needs, Canada can provide. And talking about regulatory issues, it's not all perfect in Canada. A common complaint in any Western democracy is the time it takes to get projects done. And one of the last times we saw a big rush in Canada was around LNG, maybe 15 years ago. And a lot of those LNG projects never got off the ground, partly because the regulatory process takes so long, and whether you're talking about mining permits and other things, it can take a very long time. In Canada, our division of powers, if you're not familiar with it, the provinces have a lot of powers. The provinces are responsible for natural resources, for property, and a long list of other things from education, health to a large extent. And then the federal government has responsibilities. And sometimes they overlap because our Constitution doesn't enumerate everything. The environment, for one, is a shared responsibility between the provinces and the federal government. And so sometimes with our regulatory processes, you see overlap, duplication sometimes, and that frustrates our clients. But last week, the Supreme Court of Canada released a decision that may tone down at least the federal government's powers. They released a decision where the province of Alberta had challenged the federal government with something called the Impact Assessment Act, which was a federal act, sort of an omnibus review of any project that the government deemed important enough to review. The federal government took jurisdiction to review that project from not just environmental standards aspects, but for various aspects. And the Supreme Court of Canada said you went too far. You don't have that breadth of power. And I don't think it will stop the federal government, but it'll certainly pare back a little bit. And what we hope will happen is there'll be a little bit less duplication in the regulatory processes going forward.
Well, you heard it here first, or at least maybe some of you did. So that it sounds really technical, but I think what you're basically saying is this could be the herald of easing the regulatory environment, making it easier to do business. And we've heard actually from all of you to some extent, these major advantages that Canada has to offer. And I'm going to ask a bit more of a controversial question now, and feel free to rebut me on this. But, despite these latest major investment announcements, we heard it, for example, when it comes to electric vehicles. So why isn't Canada at the forefront of discussions here in Europe when it comes to access to natural resources, given its, its political and economic stability, its skilled labor, all of these shared cultural norms and so on that we've discussed so far? Why is that? Maybe let's start with you, Javier.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm happy to contradict you, actually. we have an excellent working relation with the Canadian government, and not only at official level, but things are going in a very good direction in the real world. So I will recapitulate on our instruments. Yeah. So we have a free trade agreement since 2016. When since then, overall trade in goods has increased by 66%, which is quite good. But in the area of raw materials, it has increased by 147%, which is much better. Yeah? And you may think that, yes, since then, the price of raw materials has increased a lot, so it is normal that, relatively speaking, the value of EU imports, because we are speaking essentially of EU imports, increase more than the general trade in goods. But actually, the value of EU imports from the world only increased by 89%. So what does that mean? That means that the FTA does make a difference. Yeah. So, but we want to build on that, because we want to build on that. We did this bilateral strategic partnership. And 2021, it was the first signed by the EU, actually. So Canada, that shows that Canada is a very special partner in the area of raw materials. And in the same year, 4 projects were announced. So 3 Canadian investments in the EU and 1 EU investment in Canada. Yeah, this was not done by the Commission or the EU. This was done by real business partners who find opportunity and who find a favorable framework. So things are going quite well in this area, and we want more, of course. Huh? So we have to continue to work in this direction, because the EU needs it, because I think Canada wants it, and because the world in general also needs more raw materials and more transformation to happen in Canada and in the EU.
Well, you heard it. That's a strong institutional message there. We want more. Stefan, I give the same question to you, but I ask you a bit more broadly as well. You know, looking in the future, how can the EU and Canada work more closely together over the next couple of years? You know, respective environments and environment and energy, all of course trying to keep inflation low at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with Javier's comments, first of all, in terms of, I feel that the tailwinds between Canada and Europe haven't been this strong in a very long time. And as Rob mentioned, I don't expect this to diminish in the near term. I think this is a long-term trend. I think what we're seeing in terms of, you know, how economies are changing, where, you know, security and energy transition go hand in hand, will further strengthen, I think, the relationships between Canada and Europe. And as Javier mentioned, we're fortunate that we have a strong free trade agreement to build upon, which the U.S. doesn't have. And so we're already in a good place to build from. And looking again at our financing pipeline and projects, everything seems to point to continued strong engagement, greater collaboration, and I think it looks fairly good from our vantage point at this point in time.
Yeah, and Rob, I pass it to you as well. So looking at why perhaps it isn't at the forefront, and then also looking at, so how can it be? What's the next steps?
Yeah, I was going to also agree that in my job and in my experience, it is at the forefront. If it's not making headlines every day and it's not in the popular discussion, I think behind the scenes, governments and businesses are very active, and Canada is top of mind. Steph mentioned the IRA in the US, which creates issues for governments all over the world, but in Canada, it's also been a bit of a boon too, because there are provisions that allow for example, batteries manufactured in North America to qualify for tax credits in the US. There are provisions where if critical minerals are sourced within a country that's got a free trade agreement with the US, then again, eligible for tax credits, and I think it's been a real help. Canada is so well positioned to be a gateway to the US, but also with our Asia Pacific partnerships. It's a gateway there with our free trade agreement with Europe, hopefully with the UK soon. It's also just right in the middle of all of that potential activity. You mentioned doing what has to be done and keeping inflation low. I'll pass on that one because I think there is a cost to a lot of this. We're catching up in a lot of ways to China and other countries. It requires a lot of government support. It seems like there is a public will to do it, but there is a cost to it as well.
There is a cost to it. Well, I wonder if we could talk a bit more then about innovation, because as you mentioned, it's going to have to be supported, but how much innovation do you think really is needed? I'll stay with you, Rob, producing energy cheaply in large quantities. And I wonder if there's any kind of promising innovations that you would like to point to. I know, for example, you've got a particular interest and focus on Indigenous communities in Canada. Is there anything you'd like to highlight for our audience today?
Yeah, I guess when you talk about innovation in all of its forms, and Javier was talking about the importance of ESG issues and wanting a clean or a cleaner supply chain, and that involves environmental, social, and governance issues. One thing that's happening in Canada that is unique, I think, to the world, because we don't see it in other parts of the world to this extent, but Indigenous participation in major projects in Canada. Indigenous groups are now taking major equity stakes in these projects, and they are big supporters of these projects when they are given a meaningful say in how these projects are developed and managed, operated. I think there's a perception in Europe and elsewhere that Indigenous groups, communities are against development. And we saw it in the LNG boom where you had, and some other instances where high profile actions were taken against government plans to build projects by Indigenous groups. But again, those actions were usually aimed at wanting a bigger say in the development, not stopping them. And so you have one of our biggest infrastructure projects in Canada at the moment, maybe the biggest, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, taking oil and other petroleum products from Edmonton to Vancouver. And Indigenous groups slowed that process down, took the government to court because they weren't consulted properly. They won, and that pipeline is now being built with their support and with their proper consultation. But it looks like Indigenous groups are set up to buy that pipeline from the federal government when it actually completes. And that's in the next couple of years. So that's one example where I think there's a perception that Indigenous groups are against development, but they are supportive when they're given a say. And they are doing some really interesting things from coast to coast. In the East Coast, involved with the biggest hydrogen project, clean hydrogen. In Ontario, involved with major hydro projects. Again, groups like Ontario Hydro have said they won't build any major projects without at least a 50% equity stake from the local Indigenous populations. And so it's really interesting and encouraging to see.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving us an insight into that, Rob. And I would like to now open the floor for a couple of questions from our audience. You have some very some eminent speakers here who can talk on different on various different topics that we've had. Is there anybody that would like to ask a question to one of our guests? Yes, the gentleman there in the dark red shirt. If you could just introduce yourself, and then if you have a panelist that you would like to address your question to, you can let us know.
Hi, yes. So my name is Sebastian, and I'm a master's student at KU Leuven. Thank you for the presentations and the discussions. They were quite interesting, and I think obviously very, very relevant to our times as we're going through a climate crisis. So my question is directed towards Rob. You were discussing how in Canada you've started, or the institutions are beginning to consult Indigenous communities and sort of get their perspective on these infrastructure projects and these projects that extract raw materials, etc. in Canada. So another question that's kind of related to that is, what about, are there any organizations or any groups in that whole sphere that are looking at the environmental impacts that some of these projects have on the animals, on the wildlife in the area, or the biodiversity of a given area, etc.?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that question. The environmental issues are always at the forefront of the regulatory review process. Both the provinces and the federal government take jurisdiction over some aspects of environmental regulation. And so often you will have both the federal government and the provincial government doing environmental impact assessments. And that includes wildlife, and Indigenous communities would take that as part of their purview as well, when they're considering projects in their communities. So it's taken very seriously, and it's very time consuming.
Thank you for the question. We've got time for at least one. Oh, please go ahead. Sorry.
Just to add to that, from a perspective of a lender, I mean, EDC is an export credit agency, but we are still a signatory to the Equator Principles, to the IFC performance standards, and we also take ESG and the E to your question very seriously. Typically in large, category A and category B projects, such in the mining space or in other sectors, we typically would have engage environmental consultants, to assist us with the assessment, and then any shortfalls that are identified would actually get embedded into the loan documents. That if they're not rectified, they are actually events of default. So we do take them very seriously, and do hold the sponsors accountable.
Thanks so much for coming in on that, Stefan. So as I said, I've got time for about one burning desire question, if anybody else would like to chime in. If not, then I would love to go back to Javier, just because we talked a bit about this environmental concerns. You mentioned it in your intro. It's something the European Union is sometimes criticized for, a bit of, okay, well, not in my backyard, right? We have communities in the EU that don't want mining to happen for raw materials, but at the same time, the demand is there. And so you might be looking to other parts of the world, and you alluded to it, where there aren't necessarily those environmental protections in place. What are you doing to try and secure, to make sure that the supply chains are responsible?
Well, as I said, sustainability is a condition of reliable supply. And we are dealing with that in the EU without any change in the requirements for environmental protection, not to speak of social. But accelerated procedures are being considered, were proposed by the Commission, are being discussed by member states during the legislative process ongoing. Regarding, let's say, improved administrative coordination and proposed deadlines for so-called strategic projects. Yeah. And I want to stress no change, no relaxation of environmental or other requirements. Now, this is within our EU jurisdiction. With regard to projects in third countries, of course, the EU respects the sovereignty of those countries. However, we try to raise the environmental standards via our bilateral trade agreements. So each of them has a trade of the new generation agreement, has a trade and sustainable development chapter, where the emphasis is not so much on mandating things and introducing conditions, but rather on cooperation, on raising the standards. And second, the EU has been putting in place a number of pieces of legislation / proposals, such as on corporate sustainability, CSDDD. Well, it's a terrible acronym, Corporate Sustainability Directive, yeah, which puts in place obligations for companies supplying goods to the European market, so that they have the duty to care and to monitor whether those products have been produced according to a number of international standards. I want to emphasize this. The EU is not imposing those standards. The EU relies for these due diligence obligations on international standards. In the area of batteries, we have a more specific text. We started discussion about electrical vehicles, of which the battery has a value added of around 40–50%, something like that. And here, recently there was a compromise among the co-legislators on environmental requirements across all the life cycle of the good, so that batteries which enter the EU market have to comply all across their life. So we have a range of instruments which apply directly in the EU market and which apply via cooperation with our external partners. And again, in the Critical Raw Materials Club, which we are putting in place by the end of the year, sustainability is one of the 4 pillars.
You know, you mentioned the word cooperation there, and I think that will really be the word of the day here, and it's the word I'd like to finish this panel on. Javier, you also talked about terrible acronyms, but I think we can all agree that Critical Raw Materials Club is one of the best names the EU has come up with. Catchy, we'll remember it, and I'm sure our guests will ask you more about it, because as we said, not across the line yet, so still some negotiations to go, and please do follow up with Javier about that afterwards. But for now, I would like to thank our panelists. I've got Javier Arregui from the European Commission, Directorate General for Trade. I have Stefan Wilhelm, who's Director for Strategy at Europe at EDC, based in London, and of course Rob Brant, Managing Partner at McCarthy Tetrault in London. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me, and I'd like to invite you to thank our panelists as well.